Hello and welcome, I'm your CodeMonkey. In this lecture, we're going to learn about how we can use optional parameters in a function, meaning parameters that we are not required to use. Okay, so here is a normal regular function. It supposedly spawns some kind of unit. So it takes a spawn position, the type of the unit, the spawn rotation, and some kind of health amount. And then to call this function, we call it as usual. So we call it and pass in all of our parameters. If we run this, if it works, spawning unit of type melee with health 56 on this position, this rotation. But now let's say we want to spawn a ton of units and we don't want to be forced to pass in all of these parameters, especially for example if some of them are going to be defaulting to some amount that is going to be copy pasted all the time. Let's say for example the only thing we want to care about is the spawn position, and then it will default to all the other ones. So one option would be to simply make another version of this function. So let's make another one and let's make another version that only takes a spawn position. And then in turn, that one calls the other version, passes in the spawn position, and then passes in defaults for all the other ones. So let's say melee, quaternion.identity in order to have the regular rotation, and let's say 100 health amount. So we can do this and now do this and spawn on new vector 3 of 10, 5, 0, something like this. And if there it is, we have no error. And running the code, yep, it did work. It did use those defaults and the 1050 position. So this works. This is one valid option. But we have another option where we don't need to define multiple functions. We can simply use optional parameters. To use them, it's really simple. So we just have our function with our parameters. And then after the parameter, we simply write an equals and then assign some kind of default value. So for example, for the health amount, let's default it to 100. And now up here, when calling this function, we need to include all the other parameters. So for this one, let's include the unit type and let's include a quaternion rotation. But now we don't have to include a health amount. So like that, this one has no health amount. And if we run, yep, the health amount defaults to that 100 default. So it's really this simple. You just add equals and then some kind of default value. We just have a few simple rules for how we can use this. First is how the optional parameters, these have to appear after the mandatory parameters. So for example, if here on the unit type before the quaternion, if on this one I define an optional parameter like this, nope, here we have an error. It is saying optional parameters must appear after all the required parameters. Then another rule simply has to do with default values. Also, by the way, like I mentioned in the beginner section, the compiler doesn't really care about new lines. So if you have something with tons of parameters, you can just place them all in a new line, and that way it becomes a little bit easier to read. So like this. Okay, so like I said, the second rule simply has to do with default values. And the rule is how default values need to exist at compile time. So here we cannot construct an object. We cannot do new quaternion and then construct a new quaternion with something. Nope, this does not work. Like it says here, default parameter for value spawn rotation must be a compile time constant. So we cannot do this, but we can use, for example, the quaternion.identity. This is a constant, and yep. So we cannot use that, but we can use the default keyword. This will basically use the default value for that type. So in the case of a quaternion, which is a struct, it is simply going to initialize that struct with everything at 0. So for this struct, we can use this. And for the vector 3, same thing, we can use that. And for the unit type, this one is an enum, so we can just assign a default value. And if like this and everything works. Alternatively, we can also use constants, which is something that we're going to cover in a few lectures. So you can define a constant, and then you can definitely use that constant as a default value. So optional parameters need to have certain defaults in order to work. And then over here for passing in the parameters, since we marked all of those as defaults, we can call it just like this. And if the code runs, it works and works with all the defaults. Then alternatively, we can pass them in one by one. So for example, if we want a spawn position, let's put some kind of spawn position. And then for the unit type, let's say we want like this. So yep, we just assigned two parameters. And yep, it did work. But now let's say that the only parameter that I want to assign is just the health amount. So for that, I go up here and I just write some kind of int, so just 56. And nope, this one obviously has an error because argument 1, it expects a vector 3, not an int. So just like this, you need to pass in all the parameters in order. However, you can actually pass them without being in order. And for that, we really just need to write the name of the parameter. So in this case, the parameter is the health amount. So we write that and then a colon. And yep, just like this, it does work. This is basically calling the function and assigning the health amount parameter to this value. And on the other one, since we didn't assign them, these remain the defaults. And if you're running the code, we do see with health of 56. Also, by using this same method, we can pass in parameters in any order you want. So for example, the health amount, then let's pass in the unit type. So unit type and unit type dot something. And yep, this is definitely valid code. As long as I write the name of the parameters and then a colon, then give it a value, everything does work. Alright, so that's optional parameters. It's quite a useful feature to help you avoid having tons of function versions for all kinds of parameter combinations.